Last week I said that I would talk about the dying process in greater detail, which I will do. But first I want to talk about something a little bit preliminary to that. But let me go back to the book by Lama Yeshe, Life, Death, and After Death, which is the sort of the main theme book for this series of, I think it is 4 lectures. And in chapter 4, the death process, in the 3rd paragraph, he says, if you've received teachings on the death process before, you've probably heard terms like the earth element sinks or absorbs or dissolves. That means the earth element deteriorates. And then he goes on from that. So that'll be my segue into talking about the dying process. But on page 63, the next section, he talks about losing the ego. And so I'm going to reverse the sequence of topics. I'm going to start there and then go into talking about the dying process. It says, so what is the self-existent I? The self-existent I does not exist. Don't think that it does. In this way, we first try to educate you with words. There is no dualistic I. We push you intellectually. There's no self-existent I. But at the time of death, this understanding is not pushed intellectually. You lose your self-existent identity naturally. So that's my segue. Those 2 paragraphs are my segue into this evening's topics. And I want to start with the whole question of the I, because when we're thinking about dying, on the one hand, we think about the body dying, but on the other hand, we're really thinking about I. We're thinking about the termination of I. And that gets us to the question of what the heck are we talking about? And we all feel like we have I. I'm sitting here listening to David, right? I'm sitting here looking at this computer monitor. I'm sitting here eating a little bit of dinner. Everything that we do with this sort of self-consciousness of I. This is the self-existent I that Lama Yeshe was talking about. And so we have this fear in the dying process that the I is going to be obliterated, or we have this fear before the dying process that the I is going to be obliterated. My brother is a very smart person, an anthropologist by training, once said to me that he just could not imagine the world going on without himself, that was something that just caught him up short and just made him unbelievably nervous and ill at ease. So he didn't think about it. But every once in a while, he couldn't help but thinking about it. So it would make him really uncomfortable. And actually, I read in one of the Dharma books that I've been looking at, that's not an uncommon feeling for people, like, well, the world's going to go on without me. Well, what's this me that the world is going to go on without, right? Now, according to most Buddhist teaching, what we think of as the I, the subject of experience, is completely other than what we think it is. And this is what Lama Yeshe is referencing when he talks about the self-existent I. We think of the I as a permanent something, and we identify with it. We believe we are it very, very deeply. And when it feels threatened in some way, like by death or by anything else, we have very, very strong reactions. Now, you probably know this, but I'll repeat it anyway, just by way of establishing a framework here. You know that in the Buddhist teaching, the argument is made that actually what we consider the I to be, which is a thing, like a little person inside of ourselves, is a complete fiction. That in truth, what the I is just a concept which is designated on the body-mind, and which we have in some way appropriated through our mental habit patterns and through the way in which we're encultured also, by the way, although Buddhism doesn't talk about this, to think that there's something there more than an idea. But the basic Buddhist teaching, and this goes right back to Shakyamuni's earliest teachings, the basic Buddhist teaching is that I is a concept that's designated on the body-mind and is nothing more than that. And yet in our experience, it seems to be much more than that. So much about Buddhist practice is understanding first intellectually and then experientially the difference between what the I is and how it appears. Okay, so I think for most Western people, who are certainly people who show up for the Dharma, are fairly well educated. That's sort of a concept that you can wrap yourself around, at least intellectually. Wrapping yourself around the experience becomes much more difficult, of course, but I think we can all, without any great difficulty, get some sense of the concept. But then that raises some interesting questions, because that intersects with the Western predisposition, I will say, predisposition, to not believe in former and future lives. I talked about this fairly extensively last week. I mean, for those of us who are converts to Buddhism, we may have at least intellectually accepted the idea, or maybe we don't even accept the idea intellectually. But to get down to a deeper level of it, a deep level of belief, as in when I die, which is now an interesting question. What happens when I, if I is only a concept, what happens when I die? Okay. It's very hard for us on a deep emotional level to have a feeling that, well, there is a future life. I mean, we might be able to, in some way, to wrap ourselves around it intellectually, but it's a little problematic. And then the question is, if I is only a concept, what is it that dies and gets reborn? Okay, it's not too difficult to imagine the body dying. I mean, most of us are old enough that we've probably been around people who died, our parents, for example. I mean, maybe intimately. I was with both my parents when they died. Or maybe abstractly, maybe you're in Florida and your parents are in New York and they die, but then they're gone in some way. Or we've experienced death in some other way around us, not our own. Maybe we've lost a spouse, that happens, or good friends, whatever the case may be. So we know about it some way as far as the body is concerned. But that's as far as the body is concerned. There are other problems that are wrapped up in this. Okay. Now, here's a very interesting book. It's an interview with the Dalai Lama. It's called The Buddha Nature. Okay. I don't know how accessible it is. Subtitle is Death and Eternal Soul in Buddhism. Whoa, eternal soul? That soul is not a word you run into too often in Buddhism, except as rejecting the idea. Okay, well, the title did not come from His Holiness. The title came from the interviewer, who had a lot of questions about this issue of what persists over time. Now, I mention this book because over and over again, His Holiness emphasizes that there is an individual something that persists over time. He doesn't call it a soul. The interviewer seems to like that word. So set that aside. And don't let that create any problems, even though that's in the title. But His Holiness emphasizes over and over again that there is something which persists. He calls it the mind stream. Sometimes he calls it the Buddha nature, or he might call it the Buddha mind. Right? Now, I raise it in this context for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are pretty obvious because we're talking about this question, what persists? But it raises more questions, I think, for most people. Because what happens immediately when we start thinking that the mind stream persists over time is, first off, do we know what the mind stream is? And the mind stream, in its essence, is what's called the clear light mind, which means we experience it more or less every night when we're asleep and not dreaming, except we don't know what it is because we're not conscious. So it's hypothetical in its own way, right? But it's the essential thing, according to His Holiness, that persists over time. And it's our Buddha nature. In the context of Tantra, or in the context of discussion about dying, it's called the clear light mind, a term that I've used a lot in my lectures. Okay. All right, so I think there's some sort of quandary here. So let me read a couple passages from this book by the Dalai Lama, Mind of Clear Light, that address this question rationally or logically. So bear with me. First off, I've used the term mind, mind stream. Alternately, we could use the term consciousness. Okay, so just in case you want to look this up, on page 129 of this book, His Holiness says the following. First off, we need to talk about what is consciousness, so he defines it, or mind. Consciousness is defined as that which is luminous and knowing. This is the standard definition of consciousness in Buddhism. Then he elaborates. It is luminous in the double sense that its nature is clear and that it illuminates or reveals like a lamp that dispels darkness so that objects may be seen. Consciousness also knows objects in the sense that it at least apprehends them, even when it does not know them properly, right? So what this means is consciousness can make mistakes, like thinking that the eye is what it appears to be. That's a pretty big mistake that consciousness typically makes, okay? Consciousness can confuse appearances and reality, but it's still consciousness. And at its root, it's still, as he says, luminous and knowing in a double sense. You could also say that it's luminous in the sense that someone who experiences that essential consciousness, the essential nature of consciousness, the clear light consciousness, is illuminated. I mean, think about the word for the Buddha. He is enlightened. Enlightened, light. He's full of light. He's illuminated. He's illuminated. He radiates light. When you look at images of the Buddha, they always have an aureole, a halo, because he radiates light, because he is pure light. That's his essence. That's what's intended there. Okay, so this is the general definition of consciousness. Then His Holiness goes on to talk about it in a little bit more detail in a very interesting way. He says, consciousness is composed of moments instead of cells, atoms, or particles. In this way, consciousness and matter have basically different natures, and therefore they have different substantial causes. So let me go back to these sentences and try and tease out some detail in them that's relevant. First thing is he's making the point that matter and consciousness, although later he'll point out how they're related to each other, have very different natures. The nature of matter is that it's composed of particles or parts. And in this framework, we would include energy, although he doesn't say that here. He gets into that later. So in the usual way that we talk about the universe is made up of matter and energy, E equals mc squared, a sort of trite way of talking about a profound concept. In our common language, that is, it's trite. He's saying that matter is composed of parts. Consciousness is composed of moments. It's not composed of parts. Now, I mean, you could quibble and you could say, well, moment A and moment B and moment C are the different parts of consciousness. But in the context of Buddhist philosophy, this distinction is made between moments and parts. So that's the fundamental argument for how consciousness and matter are different from each other. And as we know, because Dignaga has made this very clear, everything must depend upon a similar cause. The substantial cause, to use the language that His Holiness has here, the substantial cause of a moment of consciousness can only be another moment of consciousness. It can't be matter because they're dissimilar, because matter is composed of particles and consciousness is a matter of, pardon the language, is a matter of moments, right? So the substantial cause, tricky word because it doesn't exactly mean substance, it means a fundamental cause. The substantial cause of a moment of consciousness is a previous moment of consciousness. And that moment of consciousness will be the cause of a subsequent moment of consciousness. So this is in an endless stream. And would be fundamentally different than the particles of matter that are related to it. So then, to go on. So here again, I'm going to quote His Holiness. Excuse me. The substantial cause of a mind or consciousness, they're used interchangeably here. The substantial cause of a mind must itself be something that is luminous and knowing, a previous moment of mind. Any moment of consciousness, therefore, requires a preceding moment of consciousness for its substantial cause, which means that there must be a beginningless continuum of mind. This is how a beginningless round of rebirth is established through reasoning. So this is the important point. This is how the notion of former and future lives is established through reasoning. This whole sort of analysis that I've been giving, right? Consciousness or mind is an endless, beginningless sequence of moments. And because it's endless, therefore, it has to continue. Another way of talking about endless. But it always has a relationship with matter. That's why there's rebirth. Conscious never exists apart fundamentally from matter. Now, that's a radical statement. I'm going to have to clarify what that means, because it doesn't mean probably what you immediately think it means. Okay, and I'm just going to leave it there for a moment. He does talk about the relationship in this section between consciousness and matter. For example, on page 131, he says, matter can be a cooperative condition of mind. Now, a cooperative condition in Buddhist philosophy, when anything comes about, there are causes and conditions. The conditions cooperate to bring it about. A good example is a seed which sprouts into a tomato plant, which is on my mind since I was planting tomatoes today, but they were already sprouted, because when we tried planting tomatoes by seed here in Santa Fe, by the time they sprouted, the summer was already gone and they were kaput. So we started this year with little sprouts. Well, actually 3-inch plants. I guess that's not a sprout. Anyway, all of that chatter aside, the water and the earth are cooperative conditions for the flourishing of the tomato plant. But the substantial cause of the tomato plant is a tomato seed, right? A sesame seed can't grow a tomato plant. Only a tomato seed can grow a tomato plant. That's the substantial cause. But the cooperating conditions are the sun, the earth, the water. They're all necessary for the plant to grow, but they're not sufficient for the plant to grow. So when he says matter can be a cooperative condition of mind, he's saying that matter is important for mind to be around, but it does not cause mind. It's different. Okay. Now, if you've ever gotten in college, gotten tangled up in all of the philosophical arguments about the relationship of mind and matter, or mind and body, or Descartes' I think, therefore I am, or any of that Western stuff, right? You can go crazy with it. And in fact, neither the philosophers nor the scientists have solved the problem of the relationship between consciousness or mind and matter. They like to think of consciousness or mind as something that emerges from the brain. As one of my teachers used to say, well, it's kind of like, kidneys secrete urine, brain secretes thoughts. Well, that kind of reductionism doesn't explain very much, and it's kind of going by the way these days, I think. But there's still a lot of people who think that. They just don't know how it works. But of course, it must work that way because everything is fundamentally matter. It can't be anything else. Okay, but we know the Buddhist view is different. And here His Holiness is laid out how the relationship works, but we still don't know what way matter and mind, we still don't know what kind of matter we're talking about. He's just saying matter. So we're going to clarify that in a few minutes. He says similarly, similarly, as in matter can be a cooperative condition for mind. Now he's going to flip this. Similarly, consciousness shapes matter, since it's our actions or karmas motivated by consciousness that structure the environment. Now that's really interesting, right? Consciousness shapes the environment. Well, it obviously does. I mean, I live in the suburbs of Santa Fe. It's full of buildings instead of pinon and juniper trees. How did that happen? Well, there are a bunch of minds involved that platted out the space, put in the roads, raised the money to build the houses, sold the houses. I mean, this is all mind in action. So if you're walking down the street looking at things in a built environment, you're looking at hundreds of minds that interacted to create that environment. Actually, if you look at a natural environment, the same thing is going on. It's just animal minds that are involved, and we don't tend to see those things. If I walk down the street to the point where the suburbs here end, I see giant anthills. That's a change in the environment created by what? Ants. But do they have minds? Well, we're not going to go there because from the Buddhist point of view, so this gets at a question that was raised earlier, from the Buddhist point of view, of course ants have minds. From the scientific point of view, do ants have minds? I don't know. I'm not going to even try to answer that question. And you can go on and on. You can see the impact of animals on the non-built environment, right? It's all a system. It all functions together. Anyway, I don't want to go there. That would be a course on Buddhist ecology, which can be interesting, but that's not what we're doing tonight. Okay. But here, when he says consciousness shapes matter, he's talking about the way in which our minds, impelled by karma, cause us to act in certain ways, and that changes things. He's being more specific. Although his next sentence here, which is interesting, the pooled influence of the karmas of many beings shape the very world system we inhabit. That's what I was talking about when I talked about the built environment. Now, here, this gets to be key. Also, according to the highest yoga tantra, now this is a term that I've used a lot, the Sanskrit, just to be really clear, is Anuttara Yoga Tantra. Tantra is divided into 4 classes. The lower classes are tantric practices of Buddha images like Tara and whatnot. But the classes are divided by more how you relate to the images than the images themselves. I'm not going to go into that. But also, according to highest yoga tantra, consciousness rides on wind that is physical. And this is really important. Consciousness rides on wind that is physical, though in its subtlest form, wind is not composed of particles. Because of this close association between mind and wind, such that they are one undifferentiable entity. Then he goes on and he talks about an enlightened being can manifest a body that's made of wind. So that's relevant when we talk about the in-between stage, but I don't want to go there right now. And here's the point. At the level of the clear light mind, the clear light mind is associated with a very subtle wind. The coarser minds are also associated with winds, but the point he's making here is that the coarser minds are associated with winds which are much more material, whereas the subtlest mind is associated with a wind which is not made of particles. Now, we have to talk about what is meant by wind. Okay. So, in the Buddhist system, actually in all the Asian philosophical and medical systems, the body is composed of parts which are described as being like earth, water, air, fire. Sometimes the word for air is wind. And in the tantric teachings about the dissolution of the body at death, a term that's used for the sequence of dissolutions is wind. So there are different kinds of wind, though. There's the wind element, and then there's the wind that's in relationship with consciousness. And they're not exactly the same thing. So this can be very confusing. Now, the general way that Buddhists talk about this wind energy, and I'm going to start using that term. I'm going to differentiate between wind as an element and wind energy, which is connected with consciousness. Okay. The general way in which Buddhists talk about this relationship between consciousness and wind energy, which His Holiness has pointed out, at least in his view, are one indifferentiable entity, tricky word entity, but anyway, one indifferentiable something, right, at the subtlest level. The relationship between them is like that of a horse and a rider. You've probably heard this metaphor before, okay? The rider directs the horse. The horse carries the rider. The horse is like the wind, and consciousness is like the rider. Consciousness determines where the wind's going to go. Consciousness determines where the wind energy is going to go. I said I was going to be specific, and I already slipped. Right? Consciousness determines where the wind energy is going to go, but the wind energy carries consciousness. Now, this is a little bit difficult concept to understand, but if you take it down to a coarser level rather than a subtler level, think about some of the emotional states of mind that you may have experienced. Okay. Like love. let's take love for an example. Romantic love, not compassionate love. Let's take romantic love as an example. Or if that's not a great example, how about lust? But also, I'd rather stick with love. Okay. When you're around the, Bob's waving at me. When you're around the person that you love, your attention goes to that person fully. Actually, sometimes when you're not around the person you love, your attention goes to that person, maybe even more so. I mean, the Sufis write lots and lots of, actually Muslims write lots and lots of poems about the beloved and how extraordinary it is when the beloved's not around and the feelings that arise. Maybe that was also in the romantic love poetry of the Middle Ages, I'm not sure. But anyhow, the point is that when you feel romantic love, your mind goes, your attention goes, catch the language, your attention goes to that person. Now, the Buddhist analysis of this is that the wind, which is related to the consciousness, has literally moved in the direction of the other person. And that's why the attention goes to the other person. Now, it's not so much that the wind energy leaves your body and goes someplace else. It doesn't have to, because your attention is what's being moved. And that's, as it were, in the body-mind. So the wind moves your attention in the body-mind to the perception of the other person. But there is a movement of internal energy. And that's the main point. And that's going to become an important point, because there are subtle wind energies like that associated with clear light mind. And there are very subtle, and this is the technical term, very subtle energies associated with a clear light mind. Then there's subtle energies that are associated with other minds. And then there are coarse energies, which are associated with the sensory functioning, the sensory minds, like seeing, hearing, and even thinking. Thinking is a subtler version of a coarse mind, and the wind associated with thinking is a subtler version of the coarse mind, but it's still categorized as a coarse mind, even though a subtler version, because it's not material in the way in which we think of material, like material. However, the coarse winds and the subtle winds are themselves material. Energy is a material thing from this point of view. And I mean, if you think about it from the point of view of physics, I suppose you could say something similar. You know, light has sort of a material quality, if you will, even though it's energy. I'll probably get in trouble with my physicist friends for saying it was like that. They probably think of things in a different way. I have a friend who is a theoretical physicist. He spends time up here at the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity Studies. In his lifetime, I think he mostly worked at Los Alamos. I don't know what he thinks about energy. He thinks mathematically. We have sometimes interesting conversations because he's a very accomplished Buddhist practitioner, but he's also a theoretical physicist that thinks mathematically. I don't know why he puts up with me, because I can barely figure out what the hypotenuse of a triangle is. Actually, I probably couldn't. That's pretty pitiful. But anyhow, we have interesting conversations. So I don't know what he thinks about energy. All right, I don't know, that's an aside. I don't know why I even went there. I get distracted. Okay, but the main point, back to the main point, is that this horse upon which consciousness rides is this wind energy, and it has material characteristics, if you will. That means it's also transformed in the dying process. So we'll talk about this. And then finally, we'll talk about what happens to the sense of I in the dying process that I've been sort of dancing around. So let me do that now, after kind of going around in this circle for quite a bit. Or I don't know. Should I stop for a minute and take questions? Or has this, I don't want it to be obscure. This is important material. Are we good? Should I take questions? What do you think? I don't see any questions happening. Oh, yes. Okay, I did. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, just one comment. Will you consider, you mentioned that consciousness is composed of moments. Could we use a synonym, experiences, composed of experiences? Isn't a moment an experience?
I think that the answer is yes. And I think that has really interesting implications. A quotation sort of floated my way across Facebook recently. There's an ongoing conference at Upaya Zen Center here in San Francisco called the Varela International Symposium. A lot of interesting Buddhist or quasi-Buddhist or Buddhist sympathetic types are gathering together to talk about some intersections of science and Buddhism within a certain context that was created by this scientist philosopher by the name of Varela. Anyhow, one of the people who participates every year is someone by the name of Evan Thompson. He's a really extraordinary philosopher. He teaches at the University of British Columbia. And the quotation that floated across the internet or Facebook as Upaya was promoting this conference, which was, I guess, taking place this weekend, was that Thompson was saying, well, you know, we have to get over this idea. Now, this is the Western way of thinking about things. We have to get over this idea that mind is something that exists in the brain or is a function of the brain. Mind is something that exists as a relationship. Mind is a relationship between cognizer and cognized. That's what mind is. It's relational. And I'm sure he goes on to talk about that in greater detail. That was the teaser, I think, on Facebook to get you to, participate in the symposium. But it gets to the point you're making that, well, what is it that he's talking about? He's talking about moments of experience. He's saying all mind is moments of experience. I don't think that conservative Buddhists or even liberal Buddhists like His Holiness would 100% agree with that. I think they would say, well, that's part of a bigger picture. But I don't think there's any problem at all in saying that moments of mind are moments of experience, because mind usually is a subject in relationship to an object. Therefore, it's a moment of experience. It gets a little complicated and tricky then, though, to talk about clear light mind, where subject and object don't exist, right? But that's a special category, which is very difficult to understand. And in fact, impossible to understand. So now as I turn to the stages of dying, I'm going to explain more about why it's impossible to understand that, or even talk about that, even though we have all this language and teachings about it. But it's problematic, okay? So I'm going to get to why it's problematic. So for this purpose, I'm going to reference this book that I talked about, which is Lati Rinpoche and Jeffrey Hopkins, Death, Intermediate State, and Rebirth in Tibetan Buddhism. And this is a commentary by Jeffrey Hopkins and Lati Rinpoche on a traditional text about the process of dying, lays out the whole process of dying. And then, by the way, if you wanted to, you could think of this book by His Holiness as kind of a more detailed commentary on this book, which is the way I do think about it. which is the reason I'm bringing all these books to this talk. Okay, let me show you through screen sharing here a chart that comes out of this book, which is very helpful. So bear with me while I screen share. Where did my screen sharing function go? Oh, here it is. Okay. You'd think I would know this stuff by now, but okay. Can everybody see this chart? Shake your head yes if you don't want to mute yourself. That's a yes. Thumbs up from Bob. That's a yes. Okay. Okay. There are 8 stages that have been identified in the process of dying. And in this chart, which is, well, it's actually 8 charts. He calls chart 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Jeffrey Hopkins lays out what those 8 stages are. So let me just sort of briefly give you an overview. And then if you want, I'll show you, I'll post all of these things. I don't know if I can post them to the link for this class. There may be some issues about that. I mean, according to fair use in these kinds of talks, we're not violating any copyright. But anyway, I'm going to leave each of these pages up long enough so you can come back and reference them as you wish, or you can get the book, which would be even better. Okay. The point is that in the process of dying, different aspects of ourselves, which are called elements, fail. This is what Lama Yeshe was referring to, if I can find his book. Where did I put it? When I opened up the class, here it is. When I opened the class, when you said, change my glasses here, hold on. If you received teachings on the death process before, you've probably heard the terms like the earth element sinks or absorbs or dissolves. Okay, so what's being referenced here is the earth element, as Lama Yeshe was talking about. And as one's dying, what happens is the earth element, or the solid aspect of oneself, begins to fail, to break apart, if you will, to not function so well. There are different ways of talking about it. But in this system, what they say is the earth element dissolves. So here he says the first cycle is simultaneous dissolution. The earth element dissolves. And he relates that to the skandhas, or the aggregate of form, which is matter, okay, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into all these details about what's in the chart. You can reference them yourself later. But internally, what you experience is that reality begins to seem mirage-like. Okay, so think about what a mirage is, right? For example, you're driving across the desert and it's hot, and there are heat waves coming off the asphalt road ahead of you, and it looks like a lake, right? But what's happening is the heat waves are obscuring the asphalt road. So it's like matter is failing in a certain sense. I'm speaking metaphorically here, right? So matter appears mirage-like as you're dying. Now, this is according to the Buddhist tradition. And remember what I was saying last week. It's not so much the case that there have been great Buddhist masters who died and then somehow remember the process when they were reborn, or that they've almost died and then they came back and they said, well, this is the process, which may have happened, but it's more that in the practice of yoga, if you're a great meditator, you begin to go through these absorptive processes as you move your attention more and more inward and more subtly to try and achieve an experience of the clear light mind. Excuse me a moment. So the first thing that happens when you're dying is that matter begins to fail. it dissolves, and you get the sense of the world as being mirage-like. The second thing that happens is that the water element begins to fail. And your experience becomes smoke-like. So in my own practice, because when you do highest yoga tantra meditation practices, you go through rehearsing these stages. It's always seemed to me that it's sort of like the appearance of smoke is almost like the mirage breaks up like steam and begins to fade away like steam. Okay, that's been sort of my experience, the way I think about it. Anyhow, the water element fails. And here he says, the aggregate of feeling begins to fail. Feeling refers to pleasure, pain, and neutrality, if you know the 5 aggregates or skandhas. Okay, now, one time when I was doing this, I kind of messed up the sequence of things here. So, okay, I have to stop screen sharing and now go to another page. Hold on a minute so that I can make this work. Okay, now back to screen sharing. Let's hope this works. Okay, right. So now the next element, oops, hold on, I didn't want that to show up. Just lost it. Okay. Something showed up I didn't want to have show up. So then I lost the thing that I did want to have show up. Let's see what we've got here. Okay, this is a little bit embarrassing, but this is always an issue for me. Okay, back to screen sharing. I want to be sure that this goes full screen. All right, now back to Zoom, screen share. There we go. You can see this chart 3 and chart 4, thumbs up, yes? You can see it, good, okay. Because the last time I tried to do something like this in an earlier lecture or talk, I don't do lectures, I guess. I thought everybody was looking at something and nobody was looking at it because I messed up the screen share process. Okay, so after the water element dissolves, what remains that's prominent, what it's dissolving into, is the fire element. That's why you get this image of smoke or steam or something like that, because the water is disappearing, right? And it dissolves into the fire element. But then the fire element dissolves, and you get the appearance of fireflies or sparks within smoke. And that's like, fire dispersing into space or dispersing into air. So that's the transitional process here, okay? And after the fire element dissolves, then the wind element or the space element dissolves. I think in wind element is better. I said it was like sparks dissolving into space, so I may be misled you. But anyhow, so the wind element now begins to dissolve. And the appearance is that of a sputtering butter lamp about to go out. Well, naturally, Tibetans don't use electric light metaphors and things like that. They use candles or butter lamp metaphors. Now here, this means the wind element, not the wind energy, which is the mount of consciousness. So that's the important distinction to make here, okay? So now the wind element begins to dissolve, and that when that happens, and this is again in the dying process, when that happens, then there's the appearance of a butter lamp that's flickering or sputtering or about to go out, okay? Now I'm going to stop the screen share and go on to the next page. I'm sorry, this is a little bit clumsy to do it this way, but at least it works. Okay. There we go. Okay, everybody can see chart 5 here? Yep, okay. Now, this is where things get really interesting, but also a little bit complicated. Because when the wind element dissolves, then what happens is what are called the 80 conceptions, or sometimes the 80 indicative conceptions, begin to dissolve after the wind element dissolves. Now here, sometimes this is called like the space-like mind, but this is the mind that thinks. This is the thinking mind that starts to dissolve. This is the conceptual mind that starts to dissolve. Okay. And His Holiness says something extremely interesting about this. If I can find this quotation. Let me turn on the light overhead. It's getting a little dark. Now I'm on page 133 of his book, Mind of Clear Light. And he's talking about these stages. He's talking about the stage where wind or the energy, etc., begins to dissolve. He says, at this point, the outer breath ceases. Well, I'm going to back up. At the beginning of the fourth phase, when the winds that serve as the mounts of the many attitudes begin to dissolve, there appears to the mind an image like the flame of a butter lamp or a candle, flickering at first and then steady. The outer breath ceases. The world generally considers this to be the moment of death, though it is actually later. In the Buddhist system, the end of breathing, the cessation of breathing, is not the moment of death. At this stage, this is when the conceptual mind is dissolving. At this stage, grosser levels of the appearance of subject and object as distinct and cut off into separate entities dissolve. Cut off into separate entities means that we have the distinct idea that subject is fundamentally different than object. The eye does not see visible forms. The ear does not hear sounds. The nose does not smell odors. The tongue does not experience tastes. And the body does not feel tangible objects. The luminous and knowing nature of the mind emerges nakedly. When the conceptual minds cease, the fundamental nature of the mind emerges nakedly. So this mind, which is usually so hard for us to find, emerges at this particular point and is there vividly. But conceptuality stops because the conceptual mind has been dissolved, it absorbs. So why is this important? Well, it's important for a lot of reasons, but in this context, the reason it's important is because from this point on, there's consciousness, but it's not cognitive consciousness. There's no subject and object division. The usual way in which our mind or our consciousness works to conceptually grasp things cannot function. It's been absorbed. This is the point at which breathing has stopped. People are said to be dead, but consciousness from the Buddhist point of view still persists in the body. But it's not conceptual consciousness. And because it's not conceptual consciousness, no concepts that we have really can be used to apply to the next three stages. I mean, we can have language, and the Buddhists have all this language, here it is, for describing the next three stages, but we have to understand that it's not 100% accurate language. It's similitudes, it's metaphors. Why is that? is because the conceptual mind doesn't exist any longer when we're in this stage of the dying process. Or if we're yogis who've mastered shamatha and have applied that to our inner experience, right? We've now withdrawn from all the sense experiences completely. Now we've withdrawn from the cognitive mind, and we have a non-conceptual, I shouldn't say we've withdrawn from the cognitive mind, we've withdrawn from the conceptual mind. So at this stage, we now have a non-conceptual awareness of what's happening. Can we even understand what a non-conceptual awareness would be? No. We don't experience it. We don't really know what it is. Or maybe we've gotten glimpses of it. I mean, I've actually gotten, I don't want to inflate myself, but I've gotten glimpses of what the non-conceptual mind looks like. It just bowls you over. It's extraordinary, you know. You can't tell anybody about it, but it transformed you when you have that experience. And that's part of the point of yoga practice, meditation practice. But this all happens when we're dying also. There's this absolute similitude between the dying process and the meditation process in highest yoga tantra. Okay. So now what happens is when you get past the conceptual mind, what happens is the mind of white appearance dawns. And it's said to be something like the rising of the moon, or the appearance of the moon, and a very clear autumn sky. And the reason for this metaphor is, at least in Tibet, the autumn sky is particularly clear, or maybe in India, the autumn sky was particularly clear. Now, if you look at this chart, you notice that the winds are doing certain things. The winds in the right and left channel below the heart enter the central channel at the base of the spine. I'm going to go into all of this stuff in detail in a week. I'm not going to go into it right now. It would carry us into very interesting territory that's very important. But I'm going to wait until next week to talk about it. Then comes the mind of red increase, and finally the mind of black near attainment. And at that point, there's a sort of like a fainting of consciousness or a swooning, and the clear light mind emerges. So it's important to remember that deep sleep is like this clear light mind, but now we're experiencing it in the process of dying. Or if we're a master yogi like Tsongkhapa, we're experiencing it when we're alive. This is the Buddha nature that His Holiness talks about. This is the essential something that continues on from life to life. And I say the essential something because we can't cognize what it really is. We can't really understand what it is, even though we are intimately it. That's the irony of all this. It is what we actually are, but our conceptual mind can in no way comprehend it or grasp it, but we can experience it. We do experience it. If we're a master yogi, we experience it and we know we're experiencing it. If we're ordinary people like ourselves, we fall asleep at night, and when we're not dreaming, we experience it, but we don't know we're experiencing it. And so this is the point that I want to make. It's with us all the time. It's with us all the time, if we could only be aware of it. This is what the practice of yoga brings us to. But dying naturally brings us to this also. This is death, according to the tradition. You experience the clear light mind. Now you die. But it's not necessarily the case that you experience the clear light mind in a moment. Now, again, His Holiness talks about this in this book that I've referenced a lot, Mind of Clear Light. He says, for some people, the experience may only last a moment, and then they're reborn. They zoom into the clear light mind, they zoom right into the intermediate state, and bang, they're reborn. For other people, it might take as much as 49 days. And he talks about why it could be one way or the other way. I'm not going to go into that. If it really interests you, you can get the book and you can read the details, right? But that's important too, because usually it's said in the Buddhist tradition, at least in the Tibetan tradition, when someone dies, you should leave the body untouched for 3 days. And the reason for that is because somebody might be in the clear light for a 3-day period, so you don't want to disturb them. And then the consciousness will leave the body. And when we talk about the channels and the drops next week, I'll explain more about what it is that actually leaves the body. But it could be that it happens just in a moment. Or it could be, if you're a master yogi, that you might be in the clear light state for 19 days or more. I met one of the Tree Rinpoches, and he was very wonderful. I thought he was a very extraordinary person. I had no idea how extraordinary he was. When he died, he was in the clear light stage for 19 days. 19 days. Amazing, right? But for most of us, it's 3 at the most. Ida.
Well, that raises a whole bunch of questions for me. So is volition, will, a conceptual mind or not a conceptual mind? Do we have will when we're in that state of clear light? Can we choose to decide to stay in that state? I mean, how that in that meditative state, so a yogi that is dying and decides to stay in that state has the will to stay.
That's a really interesting. Yeah, I understand what you're asking. Yeah.
It's non-conceptual. Will is non-conceptual.
It's non-conceptual, so how can you have will in a non-conceptual state? That's a good question. And I don't think that I've seen an answer to that question in any of the materials that I've read. Will is a very interesting concept, because what we mean by will and what Buddhists mean by will, to the extent that they have that notion, are probably quite different. I think that would be safe to say. I don't feel qualified to speak to what will might mean to somebody like His Holiness. If you asked him, well, what do you mean by will? I mean, it must be your intention to stay in the clear light state. And he would say, well, yes, it is your intention to stay in the clear light state. But one of the ways in which one could understand it, and I think that this what I'm about to say does fit in the Buddhist framework, is that one prepares to enter that state by habituating oneself to the practices. So essentially, because everything is driven by karma, when you create the habit pattern of wanting to attend to a certain state of mind, then that karma brings your attention to that state of mind, that intention, that motivation at that time. Now, is that will? It's not exactly will in the way in which we understand will, but in another way it is, because you have to decide to do the practice to accumulate the positive habit patterns, which then would have that impact on your experience when you're dying. So very much of what's happening in the dying process and what is experienced is a matter of karma, the accumulation of karma. And in fact, I mean, that's so profound that one of the things he says here, and if I can find this quote, I don't want to misquote him, so you bear with me when I look for specific things. I mean, what could be worse than misquoting the Dalai Lama?
Look, can I say something? May I say something?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's familiarizing yourself with that state.
Yes,
So it
exactly
becomes
so.
natural. Oh, thank you. That makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, without my trying to take the time to find the exact quote, His Holiness says that one of the things that's so important about practicing and therefore developing these habit patterns, if you will, or this karma, if you will, is that the state of your mind, in fact, any thoughts that you have, but the state of your mind and your motivation when you're dying determines what your next life is going to be. So let me come back to that in a minute, but let me finish sort of the conversation that we're having, Aida. And that is that, and he does say this over and over again, that part of the thing about practice and the importance of practice is you develop these incredible habit patterns. And the habit patterns, which are positive habit patterns, then take over so that even if you can't say will yourself or make a choice because you don't have the self-consciousness to do that, you have the habits are functioning and they take over. So here's a story that I remember from the Hindu tradition. Okay, I had a teacher in the Advaita Vedanta tradition for a number of years. And here's a story that he told, but it's relevant to this situation. It was a story about a parrot. Okay, so, you know, I mean, parrots can make sounds that sound like human sounds. Okay, so this parrot learned this mantra, Ram, Ram. So Ram is the is one of the Hindu deities who's and the Ram, the essence of Ram, what Ram is the essence of each being. Ram is God. God is within you. Ram is the essence of you. That's sort of the Hindu view. Okay. So this parrot parroted the word, the mantra Ram, because the person who owned the parrot was always hanging around Ram, 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 reciting the name of Ram, because that was his practice. So the parrot learned the term Ram. Okay. So one day, the parrot managed to get out of his cage, which might have seemed like a good thing, except unfortunately, this person also owned a cat. So the cat got the parrot and killed the parrot. But the parrot was always saying Ram, 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 Ram. So the very last thing that the parrot said was Ram, and then it died. Well, according to Hindu tradition, if the last thing you say before you die is the name of the Lord, then that's where you go. And sure enough, the parrot went to heaven and was with the Lord Ram, because that was the last thing he said. Okay, this is a very simplistic story, but it makes the point, doesn't it, about habit patterns, so that we don't have to worry so much about will. Because how can we have will when we're in the, but nevertheless, there are many teachings about this is what happens in the bardo, and you should do this rather than do that. So there must be a place where choice exists and capacity to make decisions exists. How is that possible? That I don't know. It's incomprehensible to me. Why is it incomprehensible? Well, because I'm not a great yogi for one thing, but also because conceptual mind doesn't exist at that point. So I don't understand how that would work. But anyhow, that's what they say. So how's that for an answer to your question? Okay. Are there other questions? Because this is really, from my point of view, a kind of good place to stop. Shayla, yeah.
This sounds probably trivial, but if I were to die in a car accident and then my body is moved, obviously because, you know, the road traffic has to go on, it's going to be disturbed.
Yes.
Does that mean that what happens then?
Well, it's not my understanding, and I'm not expert in these matters at all, okay? But my understanding is that it's best to not disturb the body, but bodies get moved and disturbed all the time. Because that's just the way it is. I mean, even in Tibet, I mean, in the ideal situation, like my first Vajrayana teacher died, and they left his body alone because they knew he was dying. He was dying of cancer. So when he died, they expected it, and they just left him there and let him sit there for a while, But for the rest of us, as minimal disturbance as possible would be desirable. I don't know that it's the case that disturbing someone, like moving a body, has dire consequences. And even if the body doesn't have an opportunity to stay at rest for 3 days, there may not be dire consequences, because it's not for sure that the consciousness will remain in the body for 3 days. It might leave immediately. It's very hard to say. When my mother died, the mortuary, I arranged this in advance. The mortuary came and they picked up her body because she was staying in an extended care facility. They picked up her body, so they disturbed her body, and they took her to the mortuary and they put her in refrigeration. And I said, please leave her there for 3 days. And then she was cremated. I mean, that was the best I could do, So hopefully that's enough. But it's probably enough because, for one thing, at the point when the breathing stops, the senses aren't functioning. So it's not clear what it is that one experiences in relationship to the external world. And yet, on the other hand, it is considered auspicious to do various prayers in the presence of the person that's dying or has passed through these various stages. So in some way, there must be some sort of influence according to the tradition. So this is, for me, to speak about this in greater detail would not be a good idea, because I can talk to you about the philosophical aspect of it, but to talk at a certain level like this, maybe I can only go so far. I hope that's helpful, though. Okay. Anything else? We're at 8:15. It really is about time to wrap things up. So if there are no more questions, then we'll stop. And I will come back next week to talk about the channels, the way the winds move in the channels, the drops, and this sort of stuff to the best of my ability. So that's where we'll take things. Okay? All righty. Good night. See you.